let me briefly introduce the topic under discussion here today by stressing three main points. So first of all, we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic has forced the German presidency to reset its priorities, which have shifted drastically towards crisis management. Migration and asylum related issues should, of course, not be left behind. So we see that Angela Merkel, for instance, has stated lately that the new pact on migration and asylum, which was announced by the Commission, remains a priority in order to solve various current challenges. At the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic has already forced the Commission to postpone the publication, which was announced to happen actually in June. And also another challenge is that member states have adopted a go-it-alone approach to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we observe structural weaknesses in the European asylum and migration system. And the first question is whether the new pact will deliver a migration and asylum policy that is acceptable to member states and at the same time fit for the challenges the EU is currently facing. My second point actually links to the TEPSA recommendations and especially what was stated by Saila Hanikowski as presented this morning in the first panel, namely that besides looking at the overall European Union migration policy, we also urgently need a reform of the common European asylum system. So what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown is that it has paralyzed movements not only within Europe, but also to Europe. So compared to 2015, the number of irregular arrivals have fallen significantly. However, an exclusive focus on arrival numbers misses the bigger picture, especially when looking at how to reorganize responsibilities and solidarity with regard to asylum. The question emerges about what could be a pragmatic approach to the presidency's effort of revising the EU asylum system, especially since some critiques have stated that it is unrealistic to expect that the common European asylum system reform can be concluded in the second half of 2020. And now to my last point about Schengen. So as stressed by Axel Dittmann this morning in the first panel, Schengen is still a big issue, and the COVID-19 crisis should help us in what are the lessons learned. So Schengen has been under pressure ever since the migration crisis of 2015-2016. We have observed the reintroduction of internal border controls by some member states. And this has, of course, shown that Schengen is still suffering from enduring loopholes. So what could, in this regard, for instance, specific institutional bodies such as the agency Frontex, which is in charge of managing the external borders of the EU, do? And how can the unique Schengen system be safeguarded and remain intact against various crises? To discuss this and other questions with you and me here today are our guests and speakers with who I would like to briefly introduce. First of all, welcome Parliamentary State Secretary Stefan Mayer. Stefan Mayer is a lawyer by training. He has been a member of the Bundestag since 2002 and Parliamentary State Secretary to the Federal Minister of the Interior, Building and Community since March 2018. Our second guest is Professor Jaap de Zwaan. Welcome, Jaap. Jaap de Zwaan is Emeritus Professor of European Union Law at Erasmus University Rotterdam and former Director of the Netherlands Institute of International Relations, Clingendale. His professional career has essentially been devoted to the domain of European integration. Jaap de Zwaan is also TEPSA's Secretary General. Then welcome Professor Adriaan Schout. Adriaan Schout is Professor of European Public Administration at the Radboud University and Senior Expert at the Clingendale Netherlands Institute of International Relations. He served as EU advisor to the Dutch government, and his research includes studies on the remains of policy competition in the EU and on the EU's multi-level management of border control. And last but not least, welcome Professor Florian Trauner. Florian Trauner holds the Jean Monnet Chaired Exact, explaining EU action in counterterrorism at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels, at the Institute for European Studies, where he also coordinates the Migration, Diversity and Justice cluster at the IES. His research interests include the European integration process with the focus on what I just said, counterterrorism policies, but also EU asylum, migration, forcible return. I'm looking forward to your inputs and to our discussion today. So without any further ado, let me hand over to Parliamentary State Secretary Stefan Meyer. Mr. Meyer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants. First of all, I want to mention that it's a big pleasure and a tremendous honor for me to be part in this high-ranking dialogue. Beside humanity, order, control and limitation of immigration, despite the corona pandemic and its economic and social consequences, remain central goals of Germany. In the context of its forthcoming council presidency, Germany and the federal government of Germany aim to focus more strongly on the issues of migration, asylum and return, and to work towards a cooperative approach to the challenges associated with these issues. In addition to the gradual return to normality and the necessary strengthening of crisis management structures in view of the corona pandemic, the topics of the Common European Asylum System, the CEAS, external border protection in conjunction with an effective common European return policy and improved opportunities for existing legal migration will play a key role during our presidency. Negotiations on the reform of the GAS depend on the announcement of the Pact on Migration and Asylum by the EU Commission during the next weeks, and certainly we are very keen on getting more information about and of the Pact on Migration and Asylum, and probably it only will be announced after the summer recess of the EU Commission and the European Parliament. Once the pact is presented, negotiations on the CAS will focus on compulsory border procedures at the external borders, the prevention of secondary migration, and questions of European solidarity. Especially the reform of the CAS will be an important matter for us. The core issues of obligatory solidarity and redistribution, as well as border procedures, should be discussed one by one to achieve a breakthrough and hand them over to the next presidency of Portugal. Themes like the CEAS and return policy will only be successful if Germany and the EU work closely and in a spirit of trust with transit and origin countries. It is therefore essential to tailor migration partnerships, improve support for protection seekers on the ground, and intensify reintegration policy. So the successful negotiation of our issues during our presidency depends on various factors. So we intend to place a particular emphasis on the reform of the Return Directive following the successful reform of the Frontex regulation. It is one of the prior legislative proposals in the work program of the Commission for this year. To address the consequences of the corona pandemic in this area, our ministry plans to pool best practice approaches from member states to develop strategies for effective and complete resumption of returns and voluntary return. As a supplement, 2 virtual workshops are planned in July and in October of this year. This will develop best practice models for the current challenges posed by the corona pandemic to voluntary return and reintegration programs. In addition, We are also planning further projects to optimize visa policy, for instance, negotiations to amend the visa regulation and to adapt legal migration. Finally, I would like to stress out that we consider the management of Europe's external borders in particular as an important building block for the success of the above-mentioned projects, so that issues such as solidarity-based distribution, improving humanitarian reception, improving legal migration, and so on can be coordinated with all EU member states. Only then, in our view, it will be possible to take long-term decisions and guarantee a holistic approach. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic affected and challenged the established procedures for immigration, asylum, and return. The issuing of visa, processing of asylum procedures, Dublin transfers, resettlement, family reunification, readmission, voluntary and assisted return could not have been carried out safely anymore and mainly come to a halt. As the efforts everyone has made show effect, all member states will continuously modify their measures, seeking a responsible way to lift the restrictions and embark on a path towards normality. The close coordination of member states remain vital, both when lifting containment measures and when a second wave might hit. While carrying on the coordination of member states during the exit of the COVID-19 measures, and while adapting the previous procedures in the field of immigration and asylum to the new realities, our objective as presidency will be to contemplate further challenges for our systems, especially those connected to the lifting of entry restrictions by member states and third countries. Let me give you one example on how we approach this. We will launch a dialogue at the European level on the challenges and opportunities which digital transformation entails for migration management. There, the whole spectrum of digital transformation will be illustrated to the participants, ranging from artificial intelligence, machine learning applications for forecasting migration flows to new communication channels and media, like social media, the virtual counseling, virtual diasporas, and digital migration management tool like facial and voice recognition and the blockchain technology. This event, 2-hour virtual meeting Migration 4.0, marks the kickoff follow-up process, which is to span the entire German Council presidency, culminating in Council or presidency conclusions or being handed over to the Portuguese presidency. I want to thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maya. And I will now hand over to Jaap. Jaap, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Victoria. I wanted to focus on a number of topics regarding the upcoming new Migration Asylum Pact. And I've prepared for that 3 statements. So I don't know whether it's possible, Victoria, to show them.
Yes, it should be. Thomas, can you share Jaap's presentation, please? Thank you.
Great. So I refer here to a couple of issues which, in my view, are the most delicate ones and the most urgent ones where we need a solution. So I'm referring to the future, not so much to all the difficulties with regard to internal borders, but more how to avoid crises which we have experienced in the context of the Syrian civil war. So first of all, with regard to the context, obviously migration is a multidimensional problematic. I mean, it starts in the countries of origin, it ends where we are trying to integrate legal migrants properly in the local environment where they will have their residence. It's a problematic of all times, so it's really a serious one. And my other statement is that generally speaking, the EU legislation as it stands now is in order. However, it is difficult to apply all these directives, regulations, which we have concluded, when we are confronted with massive influxes of migrants coming from unsafe third countries, like was the experience in the Syrian crisis. Then it appears that although, I repeat, the existing legislation as such is in order, but we are not able, especially the responsible member states, are not able to deliver properly, which means that for the future, we have to find for more solutions reflecting the collective responsibility of all the member states. And I add the third one is related to legal migration. The first one deals with the protection of our external borders, respectively with the return of illegal migrants. The point is here, obviously, the situation in the Mediterranean, first of all. My point of view is the legislation as it stands now, the Schengen handbooks with regard to external border control, is in order. The member states are responsible. So in the Mediterranean, it's Greece, it's Italy, it could be Spain, etc., etc. And they are assisted by Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard, with a couple of nuances, but essentially the main responsibility is with the member states. However, these member states, Greece and Italy, they have not always been able to live up to the obligations because of the huge numbers and what they experience as the lack of solidarity of the other member states. So I think here we clearly need more central management, central guidance that should come from a common instance and which reflects the collective responsibility of all the member states. And that brings me certainly to Frontex, European Border and Coast Guard, which should be transmitted or changed into a proper EU agency, having the primary responsibilities for the protection of the external borders, as well as the return of illegal migrants. I think we can exercise much more pressure if we do this collectively than when we are doing this individually as member states. That's the first statement. So it's more central management which is required. The second statement refers to the handling of applications for international protection, certainly, because there we hint at refugees, legal migrants, etc., etc. Here again, the reference is to the Greek islands. It was a despicable situation. It still is a despicable situation. But I repeat, in my perspective, the EU legislation as it stands now is, relatively speaking, in order. However, you cannot put all the workload with regard all these migrants coming either from Syria or from Pakistan or from Afghanistan or wherever they come from on the shoulders of the poor, I dare to say, member states in the Mediterranean, according to our legislating, having the primary responsibility. So there also, I think we should try to reflect about solutions reflecting the collective responsibilities. With regard to infrastructure, so one country, one member state has to provide for space areas, the other for housing, shelter, food, medical, social care, education to children, and what have you. And I think we should try to reflect about solutions where all member states deliver some of a responsibility. Of course, we need also fast and but fair procedures. There, obviously, we have to look for possibilities that migration officers of other member states may be able to assist the authorities of the primary responsible state. So it's about infrastructure, and it's about human capacity. It's about essentially financing. And if you can reflect and think about a system where all the member states deliver, take a share of the overall responsibility, you might do away with this very controversial and sensitive topic related to relocation, very difficult to accept for quite a number of member states. The third statement, I speed up, Victoria, is about legal migration. And here, obviously, once we have recognized the justification for international protection for individual migrants, families, and what have you, where do you settle those people? Of course, I think you have to take into account the personal preferences of the migrants involved, legal migrants in the meantime. But of course, we also have to take into account that the European Union is suffering from an aging population. There are demographic developments going on. So we need more workforce necessarily for certain sectors coming from the outside of the European Union, so third states. And there, I think we have to look for the best mechanisms to settle legal migrants there where we need them most, in light of their background, education, skills, and possibilities for migration, and last but not least, integration. So in this context, I mentioned all member states obviously have their own databases with regard to vacancies, their proper monitoring system, but I think we should also establish such a system at the central EU level that would in the end create a kind of win-win situation, profitable not only for the migrants, but also for the member states. And I recall that once a legal migrant, for example, has been settled in the Netherlands, she has always the possibility to enter the internal market after a period of legal residence of 5 years. These are the long-term residence directives of 2003 and 2011. What, Victoria, do these three statements have in common? They have something in common, and that means the problem is so huge and so big that it's very difficult to bear for individual member states. So I am looking just not only for practical solutions, but also for structural solutions, for more central guidance, central management, and essentially I discuss here the appropriateness of a proper EU immigration office. That might be a topic for the Conference on the Future of the European Union. So these are my suggestions for this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jaap, for this very interesting points. So apparently more central management. Jaap, I would kindly ask you to switch off your mic. And in the meantime, I hand over to Adrien Schout. Adrien, you have the floor. Adrien, you need to switch on your mic, sorry, otherwise we can't hear you. Thank you so much.
I hope I've done it now. Thank you, Victoria, for the floor. I'll try to do this in the 5 minutes, although it's a huge topic. Also, I want to thank Jaap for already laying down a lot of the grounds, and where Jaap is talking about collective responsibility. Or maybe you can leave the slide a little bit for because it's distracting. Where Jaap spoke about collective responsibility, he also spoke about the importance of central management. And this is where Jaap and I already have had some discussions, but I'm going to focus more on how can you shape this central management without centralization. And there we may have disagreements, but that's the discussions I think we need to have. I'm coming from a more general perspective of enforcement in the EU, so not so much about borders per se, but more on how in the EU do we set up enforcement systems that allow the management of areas where sovereignty interacts with interdependence. We see this as the big challenge in border control, but we also see it in other major areas, such as, for example, the EMU or rule of law. That requires, and this tension between sovereignty and interdependence leads to huge problems, implementation problems, enforcement problems, but also ownership problems, that member states actually feel the ownership for what they have to do, so that they respect the rules, but also that other member states feel part of a whole system and are willing to show the solidarity and willing to help. So how do we set up systems that respect sovereignty and allow us to manage the interdependence? An important topic, evidently, from a Dutch perspective, very much concerned with enforcement. And borders is an enormous case, but we can generalize it to more to other areas, as I just said. So I'm going to look at the organizational design from of the border management systems, and there are two elements I want to bring in. And one is, if you want to do enforcement systems, you have to look at European agencies. Agencies, they allow the separation of policy making and enforcement. They allow to bring in or to turn policies into executive tasks outside the Commission. They also make it possible to work with experts rather than with civil servants, etc. So agencies have these advantages, but also of transparency of the systems, etc. So when you look at enforcement, agencies is one thing to look at. But in the European context, it's not just agencies as such, but enforcement in the EU often worked with decentralized agencies as networks. That's a fundamental problem. Do you want to centralize enforcement, or do you want to work with decentralized agencies? And I think Jaap already had a preference of centralization. I'm going to talk about subsidiarity-based solutions, like we also see in other areas. Now, why is this subsidiarity so important? You need to have at the national level the professional culture. Therefore, you need to have the experts there, but also team-based approaches. So you need to work with the networks of national agencies. You also need to have the ownership at the national level. So it's very important that at EU level, you create teams of experts that monitor each other. We see the very successful examples in other areas like food safety, aviation, etc. So agencies, decentralized agencies at the national levels, and teamwork. Now, how does this compare to what we see at the level of border control at the EU? And here's where I need my slide. So if somebody could show the slide, please. The text of the Schengen evaluation system and of the Frontex regulation compared. You can see when it comes to enforcement, you will find 24 times in 6 articles, 24 times references to teams of national officials working together with the Commission, under the Commission, etc. So the Schengen evaluation system is based on subsidiarity. And if you actually talk to the people in the field, we did 29 interviews, you find that the Schengen evaluation mechanism really leads to this sense of ownership, teamwork, understanding of each other's positions, etc., naming and shaming, to some extent transparency. If you then look at Frontex, the whole regulation is full of articles stating the agency should monitor. The language is centralized. It's not the decentralized language that you find in the Schengen evaluation. That's a basic point. To what extent are officials negotiating on the packages that were already mentioned, that all affect the functioning of the borders and asylum systems, return systems? To what extent is subsidiarity defined in the legal text? That's a basic question. Now, just to finalize, if we then look at the Cheval system, the Schengen evaluation mechanism, and the vulnerability assessments of Frontex, they're hugely different. Frontex is more of a centralized agency, whereas the Schengen evaluation system is much more decentralized. Together, they have both brought the EU many advantages and really helped border control, but we haven't created a European border system, and that's because we haven't got this agency subsidiarity-based cooperation mechanism in order. and civil servants don't know how to do it. In the interviews, if we ask people the difference between the Schengen evaluation system and Frontex, you get responses like, oh, we never looked at it like that. People are not even aware. So how do you build, how do you elaborate these agency subsidiarity-based systems? Well, first of all, Frontex seems to be rather centralized, and that really is a problem, and it doesn't function as an agency. The transparency is an issue. The executive director has an enormous role. There's no naming and shaming at that level. So really, Frontex as an agency needs to be looked at. Schengen is much more team-based, which has many advantages, but it's somehow incorporated in the Commission. To improve it, again, you have to turn it into a real agency type system. I don't mind that we have different systems as long as they function and both have advantages, but also major shortcomings. Interestingly enough, there's quite a bit of fear about the development of Frontex in the interviews. So the question also is, you know, if you want to have cooperation of member states and have this sort of shared ownership, that really clashes with if you do the interviews and people talk about Frontex as the Frankenstein's monster that is taking over also in other external areas. So to conclude, the EU really has to take the design of subsidiarity-based systems as really important in all the packages that presidencies are negotiating on. They really need to know, how do you build such system that you arrive at ownership systems. The interview shows civil servants and presidencies have not a lot of knowledge about this. So training is important, and I think this is one of the important things that the EU has to look at, that there's the ownership and the professionality of border control is being improved, and subsidiarity may be one of the angles to do that. So thank you very much, Vittoria. I hope I stayed within my 5 minutes. I doubt it. Right.
Thank you so much, Adrian. No problem. Thank you for this very interesting insight about the need of a common management system and agency subsidiarity-based system. So quite different from what Jaap just said, or maybe not. But let's hear, before we start with our discussion with the floor, from Florian. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Vittoria. Hello to everybody. I will actually share a PowerPoint and move the focus a bit away from Schengen and Frontex to the Common European Asylum System. And I would like in particular to look at the challenges from a more longitudinal and data-driven perspective, kind of, you know, with a focus of what can we learn from the past for the present discussions and the German presidency. So what have been some of the key policy challenges already pre-corona crisis that the EU has been facing in the field of asylum policy? A first one is relatively well known. We face in Europe a highly uneven distribution of asylum seekers within member states. It's also highly fluctuating. So in this slide, you can see Germany has the blue color. So 1 out of 4 asylum applications in 2019 was made in Germany. But you could also see that some other states had very strongly rising numbers. Spain, for instance, doubled the number of asylum applications last year from around 50,000 to 110,000. Greece, France have also rising numbers, whereas some other states have hardly any asylum applications at all. So Slovakia has around 230 last year. Hungary, with a population of 10 million, have had 500 asylum applications in 2019. A second challenge is that the Dublin regime, which is a key pillar of the common asylum system, does not work very well. Dublin allocates responsibility for which state is responsible for an asylum applications, usually the country first entering into contact with an asylum seekers. But if you look at the number, we can see that states have requested a lot of Dublin transfers back to their entry point in the European Union, but only a very small portion here in this slide, the green line, has actually been executed. So the gap between Dublin transfers and Dublin requests has been increasing for quite some time already, indicating that something is really wrong in the system. And it's also quite interesting to look into particular states. Here we have the Dublin requests from and to Germany. And considering that Germany is not at the external borders, you may think that Germany is more transferring Dublin or more having more Dublin transfers to countries on the external borders. But this is not necessarily the case. It's almost the same amount of people being brought to Germany than being transferred from Germany to other member states. So the question is really, if the whole system that involves quite a considerable amount of political efforts, financial contributions, quite some hardship to many of the individuals being transferred against their will, is really worthwhile the effort if you see the result. And another challenge that may be worthwhile highlighting is that the asylum system is really unfair to asylum seekers as well. Regardless of 20 years of harmonization efforts, it does make a very big difference in which country an asylum seeker is submitting an application. Let's have a look at the very left column, Venezuela. So if you were a Venezuelan citizen applying for asylum in 2017 in the Czech Republic, it was basically certain that you didn't get an asylum recognition. By contrast, if you had the luck to submit it in Italy, it was almost certain that you got it. Some NGOs called the system an asylum lottery because it depended so much in which states you were submitting it there. So this is some of the challenges that the EU has been facing already pre-corona crisis. So just what has happened in the last few months. So the first development that you can observe is that the numbers of asylum applications have been sharply decreasing during the corona lockdowns and border closures, a little surprisingly probably, but it also indicates that with a decreasing number, usually the sense of urgency is also decreasing, which is not a very favorable context to reach policy outcomes or to conclude negotiations, let's say it like this, from experience. And the second point is what we could really see is that member states reacted very differently during the corona crisis. Some states have actually increased the rights for asylum seekers during the crisis. For instance, Portugal gave asylum seekers full citizenship rights temporarily so that they could get full access to health services and other public services. Many member states have basically just suspended or frozen the system as it is and said, okay, let's wait until the corona crisis is over. And a few member states, first and foremost Hungary, have used the crisis to permanently dilute the right for asylum in its territory. So it has already been quite difficult to apply for asylum in Hungary pre-corona crisis. Right now, it's basically impossible. So what does this bring to the German EU presidency? I would not like to go into very particular measures, but just on a general level. I think it's important not to make minimal adjustments to the current system. It will not suffice. We have seen in the previous reforms, just changing the nitty-gritties of the system will not make a big difference. I think there needs to be ambition to tackle some underlying problems that have been there for many years already. And another important point is the external dimension should not be considered as a substitute for a non-agreement on the internal reform. It's important to cooperate closely with countries of migrants' origin, but it's equally important to find a strong solidarity mechanism, strong responsibility mechanism within the European Union. The second point, I think, is you shouldn't allow, or Germany should try to back the Commission in not allowing certain member states to bail out more permanently from a common European asylum system. The Commission tries with infringement proceeding with others, but I think there needs political backing from other member states. There needs to be some conditionality. The EPP group has to play a role in the parliament in bringing or in ensuring that the asylum right, which is a basic human right, is also applicable in all member states. And the third point that I have here on the slide is not very present in the policy debate, but it may be worthwhile highlighting it that it's present in the academic debate, that there would be possibilities for a paradigmatic change. For instance, a few scholars have said you could avoid making the member states level the key level in asylum policy making, you could move towards more harmonized, uniform European asylum procedures, and then create a fund, incentivize municipalities, cities, and bring or ensure a distribution of asylum seekers with this kind of bottom-up incentives throughout Europe. That's already my major points. I'm looking forward to the debate, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Florian. So now, with any further ado, since we are a bit over time, I would like to open the floor for questions. So just to remind you, if you have a question, please write your name and surname in the chat saying you have a question. And I would also kindly ask you to address maybe the question directly to one of the speakers to allow for a smooth running of the session. I see that Raphael Bossong, welcome, has a question, so you can switch on your camera now and mic and ask the question. The floor is yours.
Hello, yes, thank you. I have, as ever, a comment and a question. Apologies for this bad habit, but I would like to take up the first point made by Florian, that of course paradigmatic change is hard to implement, but desirable. And I would then take this into a question specifically to State Secretary Meyer. If I heard you correctly, and correct me if I did not, you sort of indicated that also the return directive would be a real priority. And connected with that, my question then is, does that imply, of course you can't predict political negotiations, that you are ready to really unbundle, and now this is an old debate, does all elements of the common European asylum system have to go together, or are you fine with passing one or two measures and yet further postponing the ones that couldn't be resolved? So is it a conceivable scenario to move ahead with one or two items, such as the return directive, and yet further sort of move on, like for the next presidencies, the other ones that couldn't be resolved? Or are you maintaining a kind of bundle approach, that a main agreement, however it looks like, voluntary or compulsory on burden sharing, has to come first, and then you can move forward with issues like the return directive? That would be my main question. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphael. So I pass the word directly to Mr. Meyer.
Thank you very much for this very interesting question. As I said, it's expected that after the summer recess of the EU Commission and the European Parliament, the EU Commissioner Johansson will present the Pact for Asylum or the proposal for the Pact for Asylum and Migration. And certainly it's not yet clear if this proposal will consist of certain legal drafts for the different files, or if it consists of a political outreach with regard to the common European asylum system. So we are very keen on pushing forward this common European asylum system very intensively within our presidency. As I said, we cooperate very closely with the EU Commission, certainly also with the following presidencies of Portugal and of Slovenia. We are deeply convinced that it would be naive to expect that in the end of our presidency, the new common European asylum system is fixed yet, and all the different legal files are completed. So our point of view is that we are convinced that it would be a success of our presidency if we achieve it, that in the end of our presidency we have political will, political decisions, which consists of certain cornerstones of the new common European asylum system, like the mandatory border controls I already mentioned. With regard to the return directive, you're completely right. This is one of the very important legal files, and certainly the trialogue on this file has proceeded more than with regard to other files. So certainly we are open to push forward, especially those files who on the one hand are very important, like the EASO directive, like the Eurodac directive, or also like the return directive. So if it's possible to conclude the negotiations on such important files like those I already mentioned, I think we should do it. And we are quite advanced with regard to the return directive. So we appreciate especially these negotiations on the trialogue. So I think if a file is able to be concluded, yeah, it should be concluded.
Thank you very much. I now ask again the floor if there are any further questions you would like to ask. Please enter this in the chat. Otherwise, in the meantime, I see Gabriele Abed, you have the floor.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, everybody, for your interesting inputs. And the question I have is particularly to Florian, mentioning your strategy of going local, right? So I was wondering if that is going to play a role at all in terms of negotiations in the MFF with regard to structural policy and cohesion funds, because there could be a role here in terms of linking cohesion with asylum strategies in terms of going more local. Thank you.
Yes, Florian, you can directly answer if you wish to do so.
Yeah, I think there are two aspects that you can say in this. The first one is, as you mentioned it right now, more as an incentive going local. Another one would be to going more for the punishment approach, using cohesion funds, structural funds as a punishment if you don't cooperate on asylum issues. I think some politicians have put forward such proposals more than the incentive related aspects. French foreign minister said it with regard, I think in particular to Hungary, that this should be used. But if I remember well, the discussion was back then, this kind of legal connex was not possible. And the former framework, it would require some legal changes to make it possible to make this kind of cross-policy linkages between migration and asylum. And there has been quite some resistance to implement such a change. So I'm not currently aware of any advances that the positions are shifting, and this would be actually implemented in the next multi-annual financial framework. But I mean, the negotiations are not yet completed, so we may be surprised there, but I don't think it's very likely that it will happen.
Okay, let me take up maybe another question from another participant. Otherwise, I have a follow-up question request by Raphael. So first, if nobody else wants to raise a question, Raphael, you have again the floor.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the follow-up, so I really want to not monopolize. Thank you also, Mr. Meyer, for the clarification. I have maybe, if I may, one further question in regards to the further evolution of border security, and we just heard about this kind of possibility of pressurizing or not pressurizing countries. So one of the related priorities we talked about, the return directive, is of course guaranteeing access as the flip side. So quick procedures, but also maintaining access to procedures at the border in controlled centers. I mean, I understand this is still the concept that is at least majority, not maybe contested majority in Germany. So in that respect, I know this is an open forum, but we have a debate about particularly Greece, but also some other states. And, you know, Commissioner Johansson saying one thing, very strong messages about maintaining access, High Representative being there yesterday, primarily highlighting the need to defend the Greek land border. What do you see any potential of coming to a strategic agreement that you also the Council or the member states can make this commitment to maintain access procedures, while of course understanding that there need to be also a credible border security, and in particular to like situations like we had in February. So I know this goes a little bit beyond the legislative dossier, but I think at the moment we see a lot of mixed messages from lots of different actors at different institutions and different states. And is there any space for moving this also under your presidency? Or do you think this is rather the responsibility of the Commission to ensure that this principle is being safeguarded? Thank you. If you can make a comment on this, I understand it maybe also for others to comment on this if possible, if that's more preferable. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Raphael. I will first give the word to Mr. Meyer, and then if any other of the speakers want to comment, please tell me.
Thank you very much for this additional question or remark. As I already mentioned, our point of view is that it's very important and essential to focus very much on the EU external borders. So as I already explained, one of the decisive pillars, one of the cornerstones of our concept paper, the concept paper of the federal government of Germany on the common European asylum system, is that there should be mandatory border controls and the border procedure at the EU external borders. It's necessary not only to register those who are about to enter the European Union, but it's also very decisive to identify them. We have the right, but I also would say we have the obligation to identify who is about to enter the European Union. And certainly also, for instance, health checks or security checks should be made within this border procedures. Certainly, as you said, it's ought to be, or they ought to be quick, but certainly this shouldn't be. This shouldn't mean that we do asylum procedure light there. So it's very decisive that all the procedures which are conducted at the EU external border certainly totally apply to international law, to the rule of law. Certainly it also must be possible for some asylums, for the asylum seeker to object to the decisions which are made at the EU external border. We are convinced that especially those who come from countries of safe origin or from safe third countries, they should undergo these new procedures at the EU external border, because. And it was also within our panel, it was already demonstrated that the acceptance rate of asylum seekers, of those who apply for asylum, is quite different within the European Union, and certainly they are much below 50% overall. So in our eyes, it must be our main objective to reduce the number of those who enter the European Union, and we only would be open to allow those to enter the European Union who have a chance to be accepted as asylum seekers, as refugees according to the Geneva Convention, or who are about to get at least subsidiary protection. So if you are successful in reducing the number of those who enter the European Union, also the amount of those who should be distributed within the 27 EU member states is much lower. And we assume also the problem, also the political discussion is not so complicated or should not be so complicated anymore. So we as I said, we are in a very intensive dialogue with the EU Commission. Certainly we don't have total consensus on this point with the EU Commission, but we expect that at least a critical amount of our proposals of our concept paper should be also in this proposal of the EU Commission, which will be presented in the end of August or in the beginning of September. And certainly we will push forward all the technical ideas to establish an entry-exit system at the EU external border. Certainly, Europe must be open for legal migration. The European Union needs legal migration, especially of skilled and high-skilled workers. But as I said, in the end, we must establish a system which guarantees that we, as the European Union and EU member states, decide who is allowed to enter the European Union, and not others, like, for instance, criminal smugglers or human traffickers decide who is allowed to enter the European Union.
Thank you. I saw that Jaap has a comment, and with an eye on the time, I would kindly ask Jaap to keep your comment.
No, I just wanted to say that also this reference to differentiated outcomes dependent of the member state handling an application for international protection. I mean, strictly speaking, that is an unacceptable situation in light of the fact that the migrant has within the Schengen context only one chance to apply for asylum, etc., etc. So essentially, it cannot be that depending on the country where you apply for international protection, you might get a different answer. That brings me purely to my point. I think we have arrived in a situation, and to that extent, I refer also to the discussion with regard to external action, European Union as a global actor. We should not anymore try to continue muddling through with the existing procedures and rules, but really rethink how we organize better this utmost important issue in light of the fact that we have created a Schengen system. We want to go back to the situation of free traveling within the European Union. That means, as a means of compensation, we have to provide for an external protection, a very efficient external protection. And that means that necessarily you have to think about mechanisms more in light of more central governments, more central management and guidance. So that is something which we, I think, as TEPSA, as an academic framework, should take into account and perhaps develop on further, because I mean, muddling through, I think it doesn't work anymore. So the slight amendments of the return directive here, and perhaps the Dublin regulation there, I mean, these are too tiny kind of improvements. I think we have to reflect about how to restructure the overall situation, and that is why my reference was not so much to amendment of regulation directives, but more to the future conference, so the conference on the future of the European Union. I hope, Victoria, that this could be a topic which we put on the agenda of TEPSA also for the future debates. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Jaap. And again, I'm sorry that time has already run up. It was very interesting. I still have many questions, but I'm sure that we can stay in touch. Unfortunately, the networking factor of a real conference goes a bit lost when you have such a virtual format. But in case some of the participants have questions, you can contact us and we can try to keep the networking still going. So let me conclude with some takeaways that I'm taking home from this discussion. So first of all, the German presidency will focus on the common European asylum system. It is a difficult task. We have seen also in the last term that it's not just one directive. Usually it's a package of regulations and directives. So it's quite a challenge to bring everybody to the table, especially when you have also extremely different systems, asylum systems, and especially when you also have problems like the Hungarian political line, which actually is not compatible with EU law, as was rightly stated in one of the presentations. So one of the key tasks now of the European Union is to hold on to its core values, to be stronger in defending these core values. And also another important point that I'm taking away is that we will probably need, or the European Union and the Council presidency could help the European Union in this, to try to find a management system that could be centralized or decentralized, but it definitely needs to be more effective. So we already have many agencies in place, many institutional bodies in place, but there remains this tension between member states trying to protect their sovereignty and implementation tools. So this is also the problem that relates overall to the European migration and asylum policy, because it's a policy of shared competences. Yes, I would like to thank you all very much for joining this session. I would like to thank the speakers for their interventions and for sticking to the time, and also for your very, very interesting insights. And I would also kindly remind you that tomorrow we have our second day of our conference that will start at 9:30. I hope that many of you will join again. And otherwise, I wish you all a sunny, hopefully relaxing afternoon. And thank you again very much for joining this session. Bye-bye.